Chicago International Airport. A single father pulled his suitcase along, holding his 8-year-old son's hand as they headed toward their gate. Suddenly, a beautiful woman in a simple wedding dress came running toward him, cradling a 5-year-old girl in her arms. She grabbed his arm tightly, her eyes red, her voice trembling. "Please, just 40 minutes. Pretend you're my husband." The man froze completely. Behind her, 4 men in suits were sprinting through the terminal, searching for her. His son looked up. "Dad, what's happening?" The father looked at the terror in her eyes, then quietly nodded. He had no idea that single 40-minute decision was about to change 2 families forever. Daniel Brooks was 41 years old, a single father who owned a small auto repair garage and lived a quiet, disciplined life shaped by his years as a former serviceman, calm under pressure, sparing with words, the kind of man who noticed everything around him without ever needing to announce it. His son, Lucas, was 8 years old, gentle and thoughtful, deeply devoted to his father, and prone to asking the kind of unexpectedly profound questions that made adults pause mid-sentence and reconsider whatever they had been about to say. Daniel's wife had died in a car accident several years earlier, a loss that had sent him into nearly 2 years of quiet, private devastation, the kind of grief that hollows a person out slowly rather than all at once. It was Lucas, more than anything else, who had eventually pulled him back toward the surface, the simple, unavoidable responsibility of raising a small boy alone, giving Daniel a reason to keep moving forward on the mornings when moving forward felt nearly impossible. Over time, father and son had built a steady, quiet life together, one shaped by routine, patience, and a closeness that had only deepened in the absence of anyone else to share the load. Daniel had a particular lesson he repeated to his son more than any other, usually in ordinary moments that didn't seem to call for it, as though he wanted the words to become instinct rather than memory. "Son," he would say, "strength isn't about beating anyone. It's about protecting the people who need you." It was a philosophy he had carried since his own years in uniform, one that had shaped nearly every decision he made afterward, quietly and without fanfare. The two of them were at the airport that particular morning because Lucas had been selected to attend a national children's science camp in Denver, an honor he had earned through months of quiet, dedicated effort that made his father prouder than he knew how to properly express. Daniel had closed the garage for 3 full days without hesitation, unwilling to miss a single moment of his son's excitement over an opportunity like this one. Also making her way through the terminal that morning was Emily Carter, 34 years old, an architect and single mother raising her 5-year-old daughter, Sophie, largely on her own. Sophie was shy by nature, rarely straying far from her mother's side, clinging to her the way children do when the world outside still feels a little too large and uncertain to navigate alone. Emily's life carried a history far more complicated than most people around her ever guessed, one she had worked hard to keep quiet and buried. She had once been engaged to the son of an extremely wealthy family, a relationship that, from the outside, looked like exactly the kind of security most people spend their whole lives chasing. But the closer the wedding approached, the more clearly Emily saw the truth hiding beneath the surface. A fiancé capable of sudden, frightening violence, obsessively controlling in ways that grew more alarming the longer she stayed, and a string of past relationships that had left other women just as afraid as Emily eventually became herself. She called off the engagement only days before the wedding, choosing, at enormous personal risk, to walk away from the life everyone had expected her to accept without question. His family never accepted her decision. In the months that followed, they pursued her relentlessly, filing custody disputes over Sophie, sending threats disguised as legal correspondence, and applying every form of pressure their considerable wealth could buy, determined to force Emily back into a life she had risked everything to escape. There is a truth many people overlook when judging a woman who walks away from an engagement or a marriage, assuming selfishness or instability where, in reality, there is often something far more courageous underneath. Sometimes leaving isn't abandonment at all. Sometimes it is the only way a mother has left to protect her child. Emily had spent the months since calling off the wedding building a fragile, careful kind of stability for herself and Sophie, moving twice, changing her phone number more than once, and consulting quietly with lawyers about protective orders while trying, above all else, to shield her daughter from the worst of what was happening around them. She rarely let herself think too far ahead, focusing instead on getting through each week, each court filing, each unsettling message that somehow still found its way to her despite her precautions. That morning at the airport, she had allowed herself, for just a moment, to believe she and Sophie might finally be able to travel somewhere without looking over their shoulders. A small, ordinary trip that she hoped might feel, for once, like an escape rather than another battle to survive. That fragile sense of peace shattered the moment Emily spotted them across the terminal. Her former fiancé's family had somehow tracked her flight, and they had arrived at the airport in force, bringing along a lawyer and 2 hired security men, all of them scanning the crowd with the kind of purposeful focus that told Emily instantly this was no accident. If they reached her before her flight boarded, she knew exactly what would follow. Pressure to return, threats disguised as concern, and another aggressive push in the ongoing custody battle that had already consumed nearly a year of her life. Panic rose in her chest almost immediately, sharp and disorienting, her mind racing through options that all seemed to lead nowhere useful. Then, scanning the crowd desperately for anywhere to turn, her eyes landed on Daniel, standing calmly nearby with Lucas asleep against his shoulder, his large hand resting protectively against the boy's back. Something about the image, a father so clearly steady and present, so obviously trustworthy in the unguarded way he held his sleeping son, reminded her instantly of the kind of father she had always hoped, somewhere deep down, that Sophie might one day have. Acting entirely on desperate instinct rather than any clear plan, Emily rushed toward him and grabbed his arm, her grip firm despite the visible trembling running through her hands. The sentence that came out of her mouth stunned everyone within earshot. "Please pretend you're my husband," she said, breathless, her voice cracking under the weight of the moment. "Just for 40 minutes. Daniel stared at her, utterly caught off guard, processing the strange, urgent request as quickly as he could manage. Beside him, Lucas stirred slightly, blinking awake against his father's shoulder, and whispered quietly enough that only Daniel could hear him. "Dad, she's crying," he said, his voice small but observant, the way children often notice exactly the right detail before anyone explains anything to them. Daniel looked at Emily carefully, taking in the fear plainly written across her face, the protective way she held her daughter close against her chest. He didn't ask who she was. He didn't ask for an explanation at all. Instead, he asked the only question that actually mattered to him in that moment. "Is someone trying to hurt you and your daughter?" he asked steadily. Emily nodded, unable to speak through the tightness in her throat. Daniel answered simply. "Okay," he said. There is a particular kind of maturity that rarely gets celebrated the way louder, more dramatic virtues often do, the quiet decision to help a stranger not because it earns praise or recognition, but simply because a grown man understands that if he doesn't step in, there may be no one else standing close enough to help at all. Daniel had lived through enough of his own hardship to recognize real fear when he saw it, and he had learned, somewhere along the way, that hesitating to help someone in genuine danger rarely made the world any safer for anyone. He reached down and took Sophie's small hand gently in his own, and without needing to be asked, Lucas stepped forward and took her other hand, the 2 children falling into step naturally beside one another, walking together the way siblings might, as though some unspoken understanding had passed silently between them despite having only just met moments earlier. Sophie, still frightened, gripped Lucas's hand tightly, and he squeezed back reassuringly, offering her the same steady calm he had clearly absorbed from watching his father his entire life. As they began moving together through the terminal, Daniel positioned himself slightly ahead of the small group, his posture calm but alert, scanning the crowd the same practiced way he once had in uniform, never appearing rushed or panicked, simply present and unmistakably in control of the situation unfolding around them. Emily walked close beside him, still trembling slightly, still barely able to believe that a complete stranger had agreed, within seconds and without a single question about her past, to stand quietly between her family and whatever danger was closing in from behind. She kept waiting, almost instinctively, for Daniel to change his mind, to pull his arm back and ask her exactly what she had gotten him into, the way anyone reasonably cautious might have done given how little he actually knew about her. Instead, he simply adjusted his pace to match hers, glancing occasionally toward the children to make sure they stayed close, moving with the unhurried confidence of a man who had made a decision and didn't intend to second-guess it now that it mattered most. It struck her, walking beside him through the crowded terminal, how rare it was to encounter someone willing to offer that kind of steady, unconditional support to a total stranger, without negotiating terms or demanding explanations first. Lucas, meanwhile, had taken his unexpected role as Sophie's protector with quiet seriousness, glancing sideways at her every few steps to make sure she was keeping up, occasionally squeezing her hand a little tighter whenever the crowd grew thick around them. Sophie, though still visibly frightened, seemed to steady slightly with each passing minute, drawing some quiet reassurance from the boy walking beside her, someone closer to her own age who somehow already understood, without needing an explanation, that she needed someone to simply stay near her right now. Somewhere behind them, weaving through the crowd with growing urgency, the group searching for Emily continued scanning faces, occasionally stopping travelers to ask if they had seen a woman matching her description, their expressions tightening with visible frustration as minutes ticked by without success. Emily could feel the danger behind her without needing to turn around and look, a familiar, uncomfortable awareness she had grown accustomed to over the past several months. Though this time, for the first time in longer than she could remember, she wasn't facing it entirely alone. It didn't take long before the group finally spotted them, cutting quickly across the terminal with the kind of purposeful, unhurried confidence that only came from serious money and the absolute certainty of getting whatever they wanted. A middle-aged man at the front of the group, clearly the one in charge, stopped directly in front of Daniel and studied him with open suspicion. "Who are you?" he demanded, his voice sharp with authority he expected no one to question. Daniel met his gaze evenly, without hesitation. "Her husband," he said simply. Emily nearly broke down right there. The enormous risk of the lie and the sheer, steady calm with which Daniel delivered it landing somewhere deep inside her chest. The man's expression twisted with disbelief, and he immediately demanded proof, a marriage certificate, anything to confirm the claim he clearly refused to accept at face value. Daniel didn't argue or grow defensive. He simply looked the man directly in the eye and answered with the same measured calm he had carried throughout the entire encounter. "If there's a dispute," he said, "let the lawyers handle it. Don't frighten the children." His voice never rose, never wavered, carrying instead the kind of quiet authority that comes from someone who has faced far more dangerous situations than an airport confrontation and long ago stopped needing to raise his voice to be taken seriously. Sophie, sensing the tension rippling through the adults around her, wrapped her arms tightly around Daniel's leg, an instinctive reach for safety that surprised even her. Lucas, without any hesitation, stepped slightly in front of his little sister of 40 minutes, positioning his small body as though he alone could shield her from whatever was happening, a gesture that visibly moved several bystanders who had stopped nearby to watch the unfolding scene, their faces softening with quiet sympathy at the sight of a child instinctively protecting another. An airport security officer, alerted by the growing commotion, approached the group cautiously, asking calmly what was happening. Daniel explained the situation with the same composed clarity he brought to everything else, describing the group's aggressive pursuit without exaggeration or unnecessary drama, and slowly, gradually, the tension in the air began to ease. Emily, finally finding her voice again, stepped forward and began explaining the truth in full, providing documentation she had carried with her exactly for a moment like this one. Records detailing past abuse allegations, screenshots of threatening messages, and a pending protective order still awaiting final approval from the court. Faced with mounting evidence and the presence of airport security now taking careful notes, the group had little choice but to withdraw, the man who had demanded Daniel's identity moments earlier now retreating quietly with his lawyer and security detail, defeated in a way that clearly wasn't familiar to men accustomed to getting exactly what they wanted through sheer intimidation. Once they were finally out of sight, Emily's legs nearly gave out beneath her, and she reached for the nearest wall to steady herself, overwhelmed by the sudden release of tension that had been building inside her for months. "If you hadn't been here today," she said quietly, her voice still shaking, "I don't know what I would have done." Daniel shook his head gently, offering her a small, genuine smile. "No," he said. "Today happened because your daughter was very brave. There is a particular kind of heroism that rarely gets celebrated the way louder, more dramatic acts of courage often do, the quiet act of simply making someone feel, even briefly, that they are no longer facing something entirely alone. Real heroes rarely appear seeking applause. More often, they are simply the people who make everyone else around them feel a little less abandoned in the moment they need it most." Lucas, watching the exchange with quiet attentiveness, reached into his backpack and pulled out a small, worn stuffed bear he had been carrying since the flight was first announced, pressing it gently into Sophie's hands. "When you're scared," he told her seriously, in the same careful tone his father often used, "hold on to this." Sophie clutched the bear immediately, holding it against her chest the way children hold on to things that make the world feel a little safer, and Emily, watching her daughter accept the small gift, finally allowed herself to cry, the tears she had been holding back through the entire tense confrontation finally spilling freely down her cheeks. The airport around them slowly returned to its ordinary rhythm, travelers resuming their rushed walks toward distant gates, the earlier tension dissolving back into the general noise and motion of a busy terminal, as though the 40 minutes that had just unfolded hadn't threatened to upend 2 entire lives only moments before. But for the 4 of them standing together near the gate, something had clearly shifted permanently, a bond formed under pressure that neither adult fully understood yet, though both could sense, quietly and unmistakably, that it wasn't going to simply end once their separate flights finally boarded. The security officer who had intervened lingered a moment longer, quietly advising Emily on the steps she should take once she landed, offering to file an official incident report that might strengthen her ongoing case in court. Emily thanked him through tears, still holding tightly to Sophie's hand, and Daniel stood nearby, not intruding on the conversation but clearly unwilling to simply walk away while there remained any small way he could still be useful. It was a habit, she would come to learn later, that defined nearly everything about him, an instinct toward quiet, practical helpfulness that never seemed to require acknowledgement or thanks to keep functioning. Once the officer finally stepped away, satisfied that the immediate danger had passed, Emily turned back to Daniel, studying him for a long moment as though trying to memorize the details of a man she still barely knew but already trusted more than she had trusted almost anyone in years. "I don't even know how to begin thanking you," she admitted quietly, wiping at her eyes with the back of her hand. Daniel simply shrugged, the gesture entirely without pride or expectation. "You don't need to," he said. "Anyone would have done the same." Emily shook her head slowly, disagreeing gently but firmly. "No," she said, "not anyone would have." Lucas tugged lightly at his father's sleeve, looking up at him with the particular seriousness he reserved for moments he considered genuinely important. "Dad," he said, "are they going to be okay?" Daniel knelt down slightly to meet his son's eyes, considering the question carefully before answering honestly, the way he always tried to with Lucas rather than offering easy reassurances that might not hold up later. "I think so," he said, "because sometimes all people need is one person willing to stand beside them for a little while." Lucas nodded solemnly, seeming to accept the answer completely, the kind of simple, trusting acceptance only children seem able to offer without hesitation. As it turned out, both of their flights were delayed that afternoon, mechanical issues affecting one aircraft and a passing storm system slowing the other. And rather than parting ways after the confrontation had finally settled, both families found themselves waiting together in the same gate area for several additional hours. Daniel and Emily fell into easy conversation almost immediately, the earlier crisis having stripped away whatever careful reserve strangers usually maintain with one another, and they discovered quickly just how much they actually had in common beneath the surface of their very different lives. Both of them were raising children entirely on their own. Both had lost faith in different ways and for different reasons in the kind of romantic partnership most people spend their lives searching for. And both of them, without ever quite saying it in those exact words, had rebuilt their entire sense of purpose almost completely around the well-being of their children, setting aside their own needs so consistently that neither had noticed how long it had actually been since anyone had asked what they themselves might want. Nearby, Lucas and Sophie had settled into an easy, uncomplicated friendship, coloring together at a small table near the gate, sharing an ice cream cup someone's mother had bought for the group, laughing over something neither adult could quite make out from a distance, but that clearly delighted both children equally. Watching them together, Daniel offered Emily a small, thoughtful observation that seemed to carry more weight than its simplicity suggested. "Kids don't need a perfect family," he said. "They need adults who know how to love each other." Emily went quiet at that, turning the sentence over carefully in her mind. She admitted, after a long pause, something she hadn't said aloud to anyone in longer than she could remember. "This is the first time in years," she told him quietly, "that I've actually felt safe." There is a particular truth buried inside a moment like that one easy to overlook amid all the drama and urgency of an unfolding crisis. Kindness rarely solves every problem a person is facing, doesn't erase a custody battle or undo months of harassment or repair years of fear built up slowly over time. But it almost always marks the beginning of hope, the first small proof a person needs that they are not, in fact, facing everything entirely alone. As the afternoon stretched into early evening, the two families continued sitting together near the gate, occasionally interrupted by boarding announcements for other flights, the children eventually growing tired enough to lean quietly against their parents, coloring books abandoned in favor of drowsy conversation. Daniel found himself, more than once, glancing over at Emily and feeling something he hadn't expected to feel that morning, a quiet, unassuming comfort in her presence that had nothing to do with the dramatic circumstances that had first brought them together and everything to do with the steady, easy way their conversation had continued to unfold in the hours since. Emily, for her part, kept catching herself wondering how strange it was that the calmest, safest she had felt in months had arrived not through careful planning or legal maneuvering, but through the simple, unplanned kindness of a stranger who had asked for nothing in return. Before their flights were finally called, Daniel exchanged contact information with Emily, insisting quietly that she reach out if anything else happened once she landed in Denver, or even if nothing happened at all and she simply wanted someone to check in with. Emily accepted, still faintly disbelieving that a man she had known for only a matter of hours already felt like someone she could genuinely rely on. Watching Lucas and Sophie say a reluctant goodbye at the gate, promising each other they would see one another again soon, both parents exchanged a quiet, knowing look, neither one quite ready to name what exactly had shifted that afternoon, but both sensing, without needing to say it aloud, that this particular goodbye wouldn't be their last. 6 months later, Emily finally won her custody case, the court ruling decisively in her favor after reviewing the extensive documentation of threats and past abuse she had carefully compiled over the preceding year. She and Sophie began building a new life together, one no longer shadowed by the constant fear of legal ambushes or unexpected confrontations in public places. Not long after the ruling, Daniel and Lucas came to visit, and the moment Sophie saw them arrive, she ran straight into Daniel's arms without a moment's hesitation. "I'm not scared of airports anymore," she told him, beaming. Emily smiled, watching the two of them together, and then reached into her bag and pulled out a photograph, handing it carefully to Daniel. It was, unmistakably, a picture taken that very afternoon at the airport 6 months earlier, the four of them standing together near the gate, caught in an unguarded moment none of them had known was being photographed at the time. On the back, in Emily's careful handwriting, was a single sentence. 40 minutes saved our entire lives, it read. Daniel stared at the photograph for a long moment, visibly moved, unable to find words steady enough to respond right away. Lucas looked up at his father, his expression thoughtful in the way it often was when something important had settled fully into place for him. "Dad," he said quietly, "that day you didn't just help her. You taught me what it means to be a good man." Daniel pulled his son into a hug, holding him close, grateful in a way he hadn't fully expected to be for a lesson he hadn't set out to teach that morning at all, one that had simply unfolded naturally out of a decision made in less time than it takes to board a plane. Later that afternoon, the four of them sat together outside, watching planes lift off one after another into the open sky, the same ordinary sight that had once framed the most frightening hour of Emily's recent life, now simply a peaceful backdrop to an easy, unremarkable afternoon among friends who had somehow become something closer to family. Emily turned to Daniel, studying him for a moment before asking the question that had quietly lingered in her mind for months. "If I hadn't grabbed your arm that day," she asked, "do you think we'd have ever found each other?" Daniel considered the question seriously, watching another plane climb steadily into the distance before answering with the same calm certainty he had carried through every moment of that first, unforgettable encounter. "Maybe," he said, "because kindness always finds its way to the people who need it." Emily smiled at that, leaning back to watch the sky alongside him, both of them quietly understanding that whatever had begun as a desperate request between two strangers had, somewhere along the way, become something neither of them had been searching for but both had needed all along. Nearby, Lucas and Sophie sat together on the grass, the small stuffed bear he had given her that first day still tucked under her arm, worn now from months of constant company, its fur slightly flattened from being hugged so often. Watching the two children together, comfortable and unafraid in a way that would have seemed impossible 6 months earlier in that tense, crowded terminal, Emily felt something settle quietly inside her chest, the particular relief of watching her daughter simply be a child again, unburdened by fear for the first time in longer than either of them cared to remember. If a stranger needed your help in a moment of desperation, what would you do? Do you believe one small act of kindness, lasting only a few minutes, could change the entire course of someone's life? And if you were Daniel, would you dare to take the hand of a complete stranger? Not every miracle begins with love. Some miracles begin with a simple nod and a single sentence, "Okay, I'll help." And sometimes, just 40 minutes of kindness is enough to heal wounds that years never could. If this story reminded you that kindness still exists in this world, hit subscribe to join us for more meaningful stories every week. Leave a comment below. Kindness can change a destiny. Or tell us, if you were Daniel, would you have helped a complete stranger in that situation, and why? Your stories and perspectives could inspire so many others.